Hello and welcome. This is my quick guide to how to write a really good history essay. You might find this useful if you don't have much experience in writing essays, or you have experience in writing essays, but not necessarily history essays. History essays have their own particular style. Or you might have received some feedback on your previous essay suggesting that there's room for improvement. Or you might just want to improve your essay writing skills generally. Today I'll start by setting out some basic points about structuring your essays. So about the structure of the introduction, of the body, and the conclusion. And then I'll talk a bit about source use, and then I'll end with some advice about referencing. I strongly recommend that you also do the Library Research Skills module, which will help you to develop your skills in finding sources, and look over the History Referencing Guide, which will teach you how to reference those sources so that we, the markers, can see what you've done and give you the full marks for it. There are links to both of these resources on the Blackboard site. But let's talk about writing the essay itself. It's always easier when writing an essay if we have an example. I clearly don't want to use an example from our list of essay questions because that would be an unfair advantage for those of you answering that question. So the question I've set for us is, cats and dogs, which are best? When setting down to write an essay, it's important to remember what the purpose of an essay is. The purpose of an essay is to answer a question and to persuade the reader that your answer is the correct one. It's a piece of persuasive writing. You are trying to convince the reader of something. That process of persuasion is not by lies and trickery. It's by making a really convincing argument supported by solid evidence. But the purpose of that argument, that evidence, is to persuade the reader that your answer to the question is the correct one. And in order to do that, one of the first things you need to do is to answer the question. So, if the question is cats and dogs, which are best, then you need to make a decision and to put that forward directly in your essay to make your case directly for which one is better. Now, one problem I often see in essays is that students don't spell out the answer to the question in their introduction. They gradually unveil the answer over the length of the essay, finally coming to their full answer in the conclusion. I like to think of this as the detective novel approach. When reading a detective novel, you expect for the murderer to be revealed only in the last chapter. You want to be kept in suspense until the very end, when you learn that it was Colonel Mustard in the library with a candlestick. And this is actually the correct way to write an essay in some disciplines, but not in history. A history essay is not a detective novel. In a history essay, you want to begin by spelling out precisely what your answer to the question is and why that's the answer to the question. So, in a lot of essays, I see an answer to the question that looks something like this. In this essay, I will assess whether cats or dogs are better. Well, the question was, cats or dogs, which are better? So of course you'll be assessing whether cats or dogs are better. I already know you're going to do that. That's why you're writing the essay, to answer the question. So there's no point in telling me that. It's much better, much more effective to tell me right from the beginning what your answer to the question is. For example, cats are better than dogs because they are more independent, they keep vermin down, and they are less likely to chew up your possessions. That's a nice clear answer with 3 reasons why your answer is correct. Or, for the dog lovers amongst us, and I count myself as one of them, dogs are better because they are very loyal. They deter burglars and they kill fewer native birds. Again, a clear and direct answer to the question with clear reasons why this is the case. This kind of statement is called a thesis statement. Thesis is just a fancy word meaning argument. So your thesis statement sets out the argument of your essay. I would expect to see your thesis statement in the first paragraph of your essay, normally as either the first or last sentence of the paragraph. Start persuading the reader that your thesis statement, your answer to the question, is correct from the very first paragraph of your essay. That having been said, you don't have to give an exaggerated black and white answer. You don't have to say, cats are awesome in every way and dogs suck completely, or vice versa. We're not looking for an overly simplified, overly black and white kind of argument. It's okay to make that sort of argument if that's what you think, and so long as you can find evidence to support it. But it's generally better to give a more nuanced, more detailed kind of argument. So while these sorts of thesis statements are good, a better one might look like this. The comparative value of cats and dogs is contextual. Both make excellent companion animals. However, cats are better suited to deterring vermin, that is, keeping down mice and rats, while dogs are more efficient for managing livestock. So here we have an argument that goes a bit deeper and says, cats and dogs, which are better? Well, better at what? It's a more subtle, more nuanced response. And subtlety and nuance are good. They're something we look for. They're something we give marks for. So that's your thesis statement, and we expect to find your thesis statement to appear in the introduction. We expect to see not just your answer to the question, but the reasons for your answer to appear in the introduction. Let's move now to the body of the essay. Think of your introduction as a roadmap for your essay. Your introduction doesn't present your evidence, but it tells the reader what evidence you're going to present and why it matters. Just as a map represents the ground it covers, your introduction represents the structure of your essay. So sticking with our example, the body of the essay should reflect the reasons why cats and dogs, the value of cats and dogs is contextual in its structure. So here we have a body of an essay with 3 parts, one for each of the reasons why the thesis statement is correct. So one about companion animals, one about vermin, and one about livestock. So each section of the essay, which might be just a paragraph long in a short essay, but will normally be longer at a university level, several paragraphs, each section of the essay should directly address one of the points you've introduced in the introduction in support of your thesis. Also, each paragraph in the body of an essay should have a sentence setting out what the argument of that paragraph is, and that's called the topic sentence. And each paragraph should also have a sentence explaining why the evidence you set out in this paragraph is relevant to your thesis, explaining why it matters. If you have a paragraph that's really interesting, but you can't quite explain why it's relevant to your thesis, then it's best to take the paragraph out, because it's not helping your thesis. If, on the other hand, you have a paragraph with evidence that actually goes against your thesis, then you need to do one of 2 things. Set out why other evidence supporting your thesis is more important, or change your thesis to match your evidence. This might be an excellent opportunity to nuance your argument. But the structure of the body of the essay should reflect the steps you've set out in the introduction. The evidence should clearly support your thesis, and you should explicitly explain why the evidence is relevant and how it supports your thesis. Don't leave the reader to guess. It might be perfectly obvious to you why the evidence is relevant, but you can't assume that your reader can read your mind. They can only read your essay. Don't leave them guessing. Spell it out for them. And then we come to the conclusion. In the conclusion, you want to do 3 things. Briefly remind the reader of what you have demonstrated, that is your evidence, so all those wonderful points you've made about cats and dogs being good companion animals, cats being better at controlling vermin, dogs being better with livestock. Briefly remind the reader of how these points support your thesis, how they demonstrate the argument that you are making. And then finally, if you can, pull it together to show the bigger picture. What's the bigger picture to walk away with? In this case, it might be that the value of an animal species is dependent on their intended use. So that's the structure. Let's talk a bit now about evidence. Your essay depends on your evidence, on your research, particularly in a discipline like history. In history, we are particularly concerned with understanding what occurred in the past. And because the past has already happened, because we can't recreate it in the laboratory like some of the sciences can with their experiments, we are particularly dependent on the surviving traces of the past, of evidence from the past. And we access that evidence in 2 forms. Firstly, primary sources. These are literally surviving evidence from the time in question in the form of documents or photographs or physical artifacts from that time or interviews with people who witnessed the events. And secondary sources. That is, later writings by historians on the basis of the primary sources they have consulted. And above and beyond many other disciplines, history is driven by its sources, by its evidence. So you really need to make sure that you have solid evidence for your argument. So what does that mean in practice? Well, firstly, make sure you do at least the minimum set level of primary and secondary source research for your assignment. So in the instructions for your essay, you will normally see a statement to the effect of use at least 6 sources, or use at least 8 sources, or use at least 12 sources, or say use at least 3 primary sources and 5 secondary sources. And if that's what the instructions tell you to do, that's what you should do as a minimum. In order to answer a question convincingly, you need to demonstrate that you have consulted a wide range of sources, that you're in a position to know what you're talking about. If you use fewer than the required level of sources, your argument will not be convincing, and your marks will reflect that. Indeed, the essay may well not be passed at all. To put it differently, there are usually a range of different views about any given topic. If you haven't read widely enough, then the likelihood is that you won't have encountered enough different views to have an informed opinion of the topic. Similarly, if you have a question asking you to also use primary sources, then the markers want to see evidence of your primary source reading skills. If you don't use any primary sources, well, then we can't give you those marks. Conversely, if you have used the required number of sources and preferably gone above that level, and you've used the required mix of primary and secondary sources and you've used them well, all of those are good reasons for your markers to give you marks. Also, as a general rule, for an undergraduate essay, you will want to use considerably more secondary sources than primary sources. At this level, in most essays, you are relying on the work of other historians and including a few primary sources to demonstrate your skills at interpreting them, but still relying predominantly on those secondary sources. That having been said, if the instructions for the particular essay you're writing tell you something different, go with those instructions. I'm not going to talk about how to interpret your sources because we practice this every week in every tutorial when we read primary and secondary sources in order to help us answer questions about the past. That's exactly what we're doing, and that's the kind of thing you'll be doing in your essay. But I do want to talk about selecting your sources, and particularly about the need to use high-quality secondary sources. As we do more of our research online these days, it is sometimes difficult for students to tell whether a source is of good quality or not. What you should really be using are peer-reviewed sources. Let me explain what peer review is. If you go to somebody's blog site online, who controls the quality of that site? Really, only the person who writes it does. And it's very hard for you to assess whether that site is reliable or not. They might be writing excellent material, but they might simply be making it up or getting confused or outright lying. You don't know, and that makes it an unreliable source. The peer review process is as follows. When an academic submits an article or a book chapter or a book for publication, if the journal or publisher thinks it's worth pursuing, they will send it out to 2 or more experts in the field. Those experts will go through the article line by line, looking for any errors or omissions in the data or unpersuasive interpretations. This process is done anonymously, by the way. The author doesn't know who the reviewers are and vice versa. And the reviewers will set a very demanding standard. If you think you've received harsh feedback for an assignment in the past, that's nothing compared to the kind of feedback academics give each other. It can be quite brutal. And then the author must correct the mistakes, fill in the omissions, or present persuasive arguments why what they wrote in the first place was correct. And then the rewritten article goes back to the reviewers and the journal editors to assess whether the article now meets the necessary standard. The whole process is very demanding, and I say that both as a writer and as a reviewer. So that by the time a peer-reviewed publication gets published, it is normally of a very high standard indeed. Now, there can still be errors and mistakes. In recent times, there have been a number of stories of medical research around COVID-19 being rushed to publication through what later turned out to be flawed peer review processes that didn't catch error. They were done too quickly. But remember, the pressure to get research about COVID-19 out into the public arena as quickly as possible is immense because that research might save lives. As a result, errors are unfortunately more likely to occur because they're rushing. That tends not to be the case with history. So while there still can be errors, while future evidence might overturn an earlier interpretation, you're much more likely to find quality research in a peer-reviewed journal or book than in a general interest newspaper or a blog site or the like. So how can you tell whether a source is peer-reviewed? For books, looking at the publisher is a really good start. University presses, such as the Oxford University Press or Cambridge University Press and so on, are a good start, as well as well-reputed publishers such as Routledge. Any book published by Time Life is almost certainly not of an acceptable academic standard. I put that out there because many students seem to have these books on their shelves, possibly they're their parents' books, they're for a general reading, a general audience readership, and they're not of an acceptable standard. For journals, it can be tricky, and it's particularly tricky because the library catalogue includes, when you do a search on the library catalogue, it includes non-peer-reviewed sources as well as peer-reviewed sources, which is a bit of a challenge. Okay, and so sometimes students will cite something because they've found it through the library catalogue and they think of it's an acceptable standard. By itself, that's not enough of a check. So there is, however, a setting on the library catalogue that lets you search only for peer-reviewed sources. So let me show you how. Okay, so we've gone to the library catalogue and we're going to do a search for companion animals, sticking with our earlier theme. And up come an enormous number of sources. There's books. Books at the library tend to be reliable, so that's good news. But we want to look specifically for journal articles. There are many different ways in which you can narrow and shape the range of your sources. I mean, here we've got almost 500,000 sources with the words companion animals in it. That's obviously vastly more than you can possibly search through yourself. So you really do want to use search terms to narrow this down. That falls out of the scope of what I'm going to talk about here, but the library skills workshop module is exactly the one you want to do. Okay, so please do make use of that library skills module. But for us, so we could look at books on this topic, but we can also narrow it down to journal articles. And with journal articles, we can click here on peer-reviewed, and that will limit it only to peer-reviewed sources. Okay. And then it's a matter of looking through and finding an appropriate peer-reviewed source for it. So, perceptions of animal-assisted interventions, the influence of attitudes towards companion animals. That might be relevant to our argument that that whether we view animals as cats or dogs as better is a matter of perception, which is shaped by context, say, or something like that. Okay. Obviously, this is an example for this imaginary essay topic. You'd be looking for examples relevant to your essay, the actual topic you were writing on. I want to go back for a second to the all option again, which we first came in. And you'll note that the first thing that comes up is a research starter, Pets in the Pet Trade, published by Salem Press Encyclopedia. And this brings me to a point about research. It needs to be of a sufficient level of academic sophistication. You are now university students, and you should be engaging with secondary sources written for a university level. A book written, for example, for high school students is not of a sufficient quality. It might have been helpful getting you through the HSC, but now we expect you to be going to a higher level of research. Also, encyclopedias, general encyclopedias for a general readership are out. Okay, Wikipedia is not of a sufficient quality, but nor are encyclopedias such as the World Book Encyclopedia or the Britannica Encyclopedia. It's not that the information they contain will necessarily be wrong, but you need to be using more sophisticated material that goes deeper. And the Salem Press Encyclopedia is also not of an acceptable level for you to use as a source in your essay. You can certainly read it to get a basic idea of a topic for yourself before you start researching. It's a good way to learn some of the terminology to help you in your searches, for example. But you can't cite them in your essay. Likewise, you wouldn't use a general use dictionary, such as the Macquarie Dictionary or the Oxford English Dictionary, to define an important term in your essay. You need to be looking at academic definitions, not general use definitions. So you need to go to a specialist work, an encyclopedia or a dictionary relevant to your topic, such as, say, a Dictionary of Nationalism or Encyclopedia of the French Revolution. That's the kind of source you need to use for definitions, not simple dictionaries. Let's go back to my slides. I only want to talk about one more thing, and that's referencing. It's not enough for you to use good sources. You also have to show the marker how and where you have used them. And to do that, you must provide references. You should provide a reference every time you use a source. That is, every time you quote from it or draw evidence from it, or it has otherwise shaped your argument. Also, referencing must take the correct form. History is a discipline that uses footnotes, not in-text references. So in-text references are where you have open bracket, surname of author, date of publication, sometimes a page number, and then close bracket. And we refer to these as the devil's work, and we do not use them. You will be marked down if you use in-text referencing in your history essays. Instead, what we do is footnote. So a footnote is where you have a number in superscript at the end of a section where you've been using a source, normally at the end of the sentence after the punctuation, and then the corresponding number at the bottom of the page, you have that number appearing, and then the information of the source you have just cited. Okay, please note the footnote goes at the foot of the page, not at the end of the essay. The ones that go at the end of the essay are called endnotes. We want you to use footnotes. And there's a reason why we do this. Because history is such a source-focused discipline, it's really helpful to be able to read something in an essay and go, oh, I wonder what the evidence for that is, and then look straight down to the bottom of the page and see it right there, the details of where that evidence can be found. That is really important. And so that is what we expect you to do. Now, you don't have to insert these footnotes manually. There is in every word processing software available, every word processing app out there, there is a function that enables you to insert footnotes. If you don't know how to do this in the app you are using, then Google how to do it. Okay, it will save you an enormous amount of time rather than trying to do it manually. Now, the other thing to know about footnotes is that different types of sources, that is books, articles, chapters, and so on, have the information about them is presented somewhat differently, and also that there are different styles of footnoting that are used in different kinds of publications. In history at this university, we use Chicago footnoting, and so it's important to follow the Chicago footnoting style. There is an extensive essay referencing guide on Blackboard, as well as some practice exercises if you feel you need some practice in how to do this, and I strongly encourage you make use of them. Okay, footnoting is a little tricky when you start, but the faster you get into it, the quicker it becomes natural. Okay, so it is well worth the time to do that exercise and become familiar with that process. Okay, finally, your essay ends with a bibliography. In history, the bibliography is the list of sources that you have used in writing your essay. If you have used sources in writing your essay, you must show where you have used them in the footnotes. And so any source that you have used in your footnotes must also appear in your bibliography. That having been said, if you can't show me in the footnotes or can't show your marker in the footnotes where you have used a source, if you've read it and it was sort of generally interesting, but there's no real point in the essay where you've used it, as far as your essay is concerned, you haven't used it for that essay and it can't appear in the bibliography. Okay, so the sources in your bibliography must match with the sources in your footnotes. And again, the referencing guide provides detailed instructions on Blackboard as to how to do this. Okay, so now you know how to write a thesis statement and an introduction. You know how to structure your paragraphs in the body of your essay, and you know how to bring it together in the conclusion. You know what kinds of sources you should be using, and you know that you will need to show your marker where and how you have used those sources through your referencing. Now all you have to do is to pick a question, do the research, and write your essay. We look forward to reading your essays.